Miami Beach Urban Studios Live Art Talk with Jennifer Printz. My name is Colette Mello. I'll be hosting today's talk. I'd like to thank the Miami Beach Department of Tourism and Office of Cultural Affairs for supporting these art talks and for their continued support during these difficult times. Miami Beach Urban Studios, known as MBUS, is an incubator for communication, architecture, and the arts. Today we have Jennifer Printz with us. She is a FIU art professor and mixed media artist that works in photography, printmaking, drawing, collage, and bookbinding. She has been exhibited abroad and nationally, and most recently in the online exhibition Making a Way at the South Bend Museum of Art, and that exhibition is open until December 27th. She has participated in multiple residencies throughout the world. Her most recent residency in Paris was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Her ephemeral works in paper are influenced by contemporary physics, contemplative practices, and liminal beauty. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today. I look forward to hearing more about your practice.
Thank you, Colette. I'll go ahead and get the screen share going here. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Awesome. So I thought I would kind of focus the talk today, and this is a recent view of my working surface and some of the pencils that I've sacrificed, around the idea of points in my practice where I've had to pivot. And to be really honest, I think I'm thinking of it through that filter because so much of life since March, we've all had to kind of pivot and adapt. And I think for me as an artist and for a lot of the other artists out there, the question is never, will I make art? That's always a yes, but the question oftentimes becomes how or under what context will I make art? So that's sort of the filter I was thinking about today. And I'm going to go back in time to some of my work right after graduate school. Throughout both undergrad and graduate school, my work was really focused on the figure. And through this lens of considering the figure and the body as both beautiful and ugly, you know, that kind of objectivity of how something could attract and repulse us at the same time. These are fairly large scale charcoal drawings. They're 4 feet by 6 feet. And so you can imagine with that kind of surface, charcoal being a powdery material, it's fairly messy to work. And in fact, there oftentimes I'd walk away from working on these materials with kind of a patina of charcoal on my face. But then right about this time, I made a move from living and teaching in a small town in the Midwest to Los Angeles. And it just so happened to be the place where I was living. The second bedroom was going to be my studio space, had white carpet. And
that should have been interesting.
Yeah. So I felt that was a point where I really couldn't continue along the same lines with that work. Or I guess I could have and paid the replacement cost for the carpet. But instead I started to look and think differently about ways that I could still deal with issues that I was interested in and make art. And that in particular, I started looking at my inkjet and laser printers as art making tools. You know, before I'd been using them for printing out resumes, artist statements, things like that. And at this point, in 2007, I created the first piece that really kind of focused on using that technology in art making. This piece is entitled Inside of Me, is made up of 100 little figures. And on these figures were printed all of these mirrored views of the inside of the body. So you can see here, x-rays, molecular views, all of these different views, and they were printed and then all hand cut into this silhouette, which was actually a sizing chart from a Gap store, and then they're suspended on monofilament. And I felt like this was a point when my practice just really kind of opened up in a way that it hadn't before. The same ideas there. I'm still interested in dealing with the body. It's just all of a sudden light and shadow becomes part of the play. My own imagery and appropriated imagery starts to become part of the play. And I even started thinking about drawing a little bit differently, because when you're hand hunting 100 items out, to me anyway, it starts to feel much like creating a drawing.
How large are these, and how large were these figures?
They're actually fairly small. So this is kind of a close-up so you could see some of the details. I was just using a regular printer at that time. I hadn't made the investment into a large format. So these figures are about 10 inches tall. So nice and portable.
Nice. And this was in grad school?
This is after grad school, when I was living in Los Angeles. Also, while working in LA, one of the things that I started experimenting and thinking about in a lot of different ways was paper. So I started working with inkjet printers, and I was working for Hiromi Paper in Santa Monica. And Hiromi San is the largest importer of Japanese paper in the US. And that opened me up to thinking about paper in a very tactile way. And for this series, I was actually printing photographs of skin onto some of the paper I had purchased at Hiromi, which was very thin and delicate, and then drawing on top of it with graphite. And this is the first time that I actually had started doing that, and it's something I continue to do at different times with different series. But it was that layering that this is the first place that it started in my actual drawing. And this series was loosely inspired by anatomical images. And again, thinking about that kind of duality of, what I know about my body, what I don't know, and how the two kind of work against or apart from each other, and in particular in our mindset. And maybe, again, that idea of objectivity that most of us really are, we're intrigued with the surface level of the body, but maybe not as comfortable with thinking and looking at images of the interior as well.
Really beautiful.
Thank you. So oftentimes my work has been influenced by materials, but also it's usually one particular guiding question that will lead my work. And I think one of the things you'll see is I'm a serial artist. By that I mean, of course, that I like to come up with an idea or a concept and exploit it through multiple works. So bodies of work, usually anywhere from 20 to 50 pieces in the work, just depending. And for this series, it was really focused around, this is immediately after the skin series, that overarching question of what is something that all human beings on the planet have in common. And I was the only way I could break that down was into biology and thinking about, well, we're all mammals, we all have bones. So that's where this work was coming from. And then I also sort of limited it in another way through materials by just using this antique ledger paper that had been given to me, a little bit of collage, and graphite. So I had these working parameters, which is kind of strange to do, but sometimes when we build those kind of parameters, we force ourselves to be more creative because we have to kind of respond to them. And I felt like this was the case in this body of work. So this one from Adam, images playing with the idea of rib bones and even the structure of the rib. One of the things, of course, just by definition, to be considered a mammal, we have hair, or we may or may not have hair, which this drawing takes on a new meaning to me recently, having experienced some hair loss. Also that idea of cellular exchange, metabolism, and breathing. And you can see here that I really had fun with this work. And I think that's a common thing. I want to have fun with what I'm doing. And so this was first, all of these little circles on this side are actually hand cut from magazines. And then I used the same stencil and just repeated it over again in the graphite for that buildup and density of mark. And this is the first time I had worked on ledger paper, and it felt appropriate for this work. I had recently just been gifted these huge ledger books by a friend after the completion of one project, and had discovered, I didn't know until this point of time, the indigenous drawings on ledger paper, which were actually the first drawings that any native peoples in the US had done on paper after they were moved to the reservations. So that kind of idea of exchange and commonality kind of came into play here as well. So the point in which the body kind of became less of a focus in my work was in 2014. And the big pivot there happened in a couple of different ways. One, I was preparing for an artist residency on the island of Malta, which is right smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean. And I had no idea what supplies or what I would find during my time there. But I knew I had to make enough work for an exhibition shortly after. So I was trying to preload and have things prepared. And that's when I was like, well, what can I take anywhere and work with it? And that led me to working with just your basic mechanical pencils, because I could take mechanical pencils, lots of lead, put them in a portfolio and travel with them really easily. At this point in time, I had made the move from Los Angeles to Virginia. And I'm going to flip ahead here. One of the things that really floored me and amazed me with the move was the difference in the quality of the sky. And so just by accident, in some ways, I started intuitively just documenting the skies that were around me. And it was like I suddenly had this awe for the natural environment again. And at first there was no plan. It was just, I would see these kind of vistas and started documenting them on my iPhone, on my SLR, things of that nature, not really expecting it to lead anywhere, just sort of collecting them as recordings of that moment. And then when I was preparing to go to Malta, it seemed like the right time to do something with those images. And I thought, well, let's just start printing them out and see where things could go. And so as I was prepping and I printed these images out, these are 5x7. I also printed some larger ones out. I started thinking a lot about a really common question. And maybe it's so common, it's so innocent that outside of the age of 4, I hadn't asked it. And that was, what holds those clouds up in the sky? So when I took all of these printouts and my mechanical pencils with me to Malta, I started exploring that question in drawn form, with thinking about things like scaffolding and structures that might hold the skies up, actually drawing in or thinking about what are the molecules of air and things that I can't with my invisible eye see that might be holding and interacting with the clouds. I let some of my humor and response to the environment come in. So I was thinking about, what if there are invisible clouds that hold up the clouds that I do see? And what if I drew the invisible clouds that held up the clouds I do see? Sort of like a Buddhist cone almost. And being in Malta in some ways was like being in Miami Beach. You know, the water was right there. And so there was at some point I started thinking and meditating on the similarities between the qualities of air and water as fluid, and kind of merging those into my work as well. And thinking too about that fluid quality, and the Baroque drawings and paintings I was seeing from Caravaggio, and my own kind of obsessive nature here with thinking of radiation, and things like that. And then that filter of the skies, maybe being something that could just be folded back in space and time.
These are really lovely. I remember when I first saw these, and I like that you made the analogy about your childhood, because it took me back to when you're a child and you're looking up at the clouds and you're making figures out of them. That's what I thought. And then I also think of, our fascination with the sky. And, I just think of the weekend we just had the SpaceX landing. We've always had this really, humankind has always had this interest in exploring what's up there. So I find these really fascinating and beautiful.
Thank you. And I think, that's one of the reasons I've continued to use images of the sky for now. It's like, it is so rich. If you think about it, it's that 10-mile swath of gases above our head is what allows for all life here on this planet. And then, throughout history, it's been a place that it's shown up in our folklore from, the home of various gods and deities.
Yes.
But then it's a question like that question, what holds the clouds up? It's very innocent. Small children ask it, but you really have to get at the heart of physics, right? To start to understand it. So that kind of question kind of started to open up a lot of exploration to me of getting to understand more about how the universe, how life is just organized. And I sometimes refer to that as the invisible architecture of life that's around us.
Nice. I love that.
Thank you. And I'll say too, while I'm back, I'm still photographing. I've gone out into the Everglades. There's still points in times like just yesterday, we got our dog out for a quick walk, and I just went crazy because I was noticing you could literally, where I live here in Pinecrest, you could see like how there were two weather fronts that were butting up against each other, and the sky seemed to be divided in two. So I've become much more attuned, and I'm still kind of taking these photos and responding to them in different ways. So research is a part of my work. And one of the things that I have done throughout the years is, and one of the things I'm missing now is going to museums and libraries, that kind of tangible thing. And another kind of big pivot moment was visiting a rare books collection. And the librarian I was working with brought a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicles out for me to see. And the Nuremberg Chronicles are from the 15th century, and they tell the story of the world up to that point through the perspective of the city of Nuremberg. And what you're looking at are a series of images that depict the typical Judeo-Christian creation story. And especially this image here just completely blew my mind because it was just so minimal and elegant that, they started off that the world began as a circle. And then they started to subdivide it, which in some ways makes me think of, cellular biology. And of course, this was hundreds of years before Hooke got the microscope going, but it just clicked. There was something about these images that seeing them, I didn't want to leave, I wanted to take this old book with me that kind of sent me on a path for a different body of work that literally started playing with this idea directly. And so I did a series of drawings, and it originally started off with 7 because they're in the Nuremberg illustrations. There are the 7 illustrations for that one day of for each day of the creation story. So I started there with just the beginning, and I think maybe part of one of the things I was responding to was that beautiful kind of minimal format of the circle on the page, and so I kept true to that, and that just kept going through the drawing. So embarking today is sort of like my beginning. You could also equate this to like the Big Bang, you know, that kind of density of marks building up. And again, this is done with a very fine mechanical pencil, just, you know, overlapping and building up those marks on top of the photograph until it just becomes this sort of gentle color shift underneath. The other one, Intricacies and Colossi, playing a little bit more with that idea of growth, subterranean things happening. And then sometimes, I guess I'm weird, I will own it today, I like to set little challenges up in my work. And it's like, well, why can't I draw the effect of paint dripping? And so that was literally what I was playing with here. Was to capture that sort of feel in the drawing as I was working on it.
It has a feel that you're walking or you're flying through a portal. It's really has such an elegant quality to it, or ephemeral quality. I just love it. It's really wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And I know it's you, so it's just your layers of photography and then your graphite.
Right. Yes.
And you never work in charcoal. You always work.
I tend to work more in graphite. I like that precision. And you can get it in charcoal, and particularly I think with reductive charcoal you can, but I like the precision. And I think I'll have to tell you a little bit about my love of graphite too, and why I keep working with it. Is one of the other themes in my work is that interconnectedness of all life forms, all beings, and graphite is carbon-based. And all life on Earth is carbon-based. So I feel like it's a nice metaphor for that, since it plays directly with that. I also love the fact that graphite is so ubiquitous. You know, you can go to pretty much any convenience store, any grocery store, and pick up a lead, quote unquote, lead pencil, a graphite pencil here in the US. So it's that, there's that commonality, that commonness of it that I like to play with for the kind of the poetic quality that I want within my work. This piece, and here I gave you kind of a detail so you can see, and this is again part of what I can only do with the mechanical pencil to really get in there and to get these very subtle works. So that detail area is probably about 4 inches tall, just to give you a sense of scale. So it's not that large. Unwanted and transfixed, here thinking about flight and uplifting things and the kind of the Genesis creation story. And a few others here. So I started with, again, the original 7, just based on the Nuremberg Chronicle. And then from there, I think there ended up being a total of 21 in this series. At this point in time, I also was mounting all of my drawings on wooden panels, because sometimes the buildup of graphite would be so heavy that the paper would start to buckle. It couldn't handle that much repetitive mark making. So these, in some regards, are very object-like and hang on the wall, just like a painting.
Do you ever use canvas at all, or do you always work on paper?
I tend to work on paper. I have done some explorations of drawing directly onto wooden boards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like the super smooth surface. And I I know that another thing that would bother me with canvas is the way canvas can give.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, wood or paper on a hard surface doesn't have that give. So there's that tactility that I really like um, when I'm drawing. And I think a lot about paper surface. And a lot of times in my drawing class, I'll have students explore and we'll talk about different types of paper because it changes everything about a drawing. And for me, with this super detailed work, I want a very smooth, slick paper, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So moving ahead to kind of another pivot point, and you mentioned Paris. The first time I got to go to Paris was in the spring of 2017 when I was awarded an artist residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts. And these are actually the views from my windows of this tiny little studio. It was an amazing opportunity, and it let me look at my work in a whole new filter. Again, like the Malta situation, I set things up to get going beforehand so that I'd be able to complete work while I was there. But then I also just kind of let myself adjust and respond to the situations and the things that I was seeing in Paris. And what I was really surprised with is how my work in this series really started pushing more and more towards minimalism and more towards really, instead of showing off those textures and forms that I've worked on in other drawings, of just, working with drawing as being more of a gradient tone and letting go of the virtuoso, if you will, in that way, and just thinking of it as another color block or form to work with. This work was also really heavily influenced by some team teaching I was doing with a physicist. We were actually teaching a class on art and physics. And so I started thinking a lot about things like systems theory, how scientists actually measure the sky, which is in the piece here on the right. They do literally divide the sky for charting into these long kind of stripes to help chart and navigate things. So I played with that a lot in the work, as well as oftentimes a response to just some of the architecture and things that I saw around Paris. And I felt like this work has a different tone. It's much more soft to me than the previous pieces, and quiet in a different way.
Well, I definitely like the architectural aspect, and the ledger paper already has the grids already, so you're not making the grids. But is that something you've ever played with on yourself with the grids in your practice, besides having them on the paper?
With actually creating grids?
Yes.
Yeah, I think definitely, and I think you'll see that in a later piece coming up, that the drawing itself is actually breaking into a grid. The ledger paper is intriguing to me, and I'm literally taking it out of antique books that I find. And I do that because it's built for this organizational structure, right? Ledgers are about, transaction. Item B purchased by person. The pages are always numbered. There's some sort of classification there. And I'm sort of completely taking that apart and letting a little bit of disorganization or play with expectations come in the work. So people a lot of times notice the numbers on the pages. Once the pages are removed from the book, they're out of sequence. So that kind of play comes in hand. I also really love that it's just this antique repurposed item that I could play with. I love things that have intrinsic history. I'm one of those people. I love antiques and antique stores, and I love to imagine and think about, who held an item before. So I like working with paper that actually would have been on someone else's bookshelf, or that would have been used for some other reason than what I'm using it for. Um, does that make sense?
Yes, and I love these grids. Yes, I definitely see that.
Yeah. And
Fantastic.
And I like that you mentioned architecture, because at some point with the works, it sort of became this formalist play for me as well. It's like, how can I create the illusion of three-dimensional space with the most limited tools? So in this case, two triangles and a line, or a rectangle or part of a rectangle in three lines, to create that illusion of three-dimensional space. And that's something that keeps coming back again and again in my work in different ways. So I also do have I draw a lot, but as you mentioned in the introduction, I do have a background in printmaking. And actually my MFA is in printmaking, and I spent some time as a master printer when I lived and worked in LA. So occasionally I'll return to printmaking for different projects. And this was a series that I completed in 2018 of relief prints. And I'll use that word kind of loosely, and I'll move ahead so you can actually see how these pieces were made. Again, I'm using repurposed materials. So these are some scrap pieces of wood that the technical director at the theater gave to me, and some other leftovers from my own projects that I actually cut into shapes before I got started. And then once I had cut these pieces into shape, I started composing the pieces, and would actually just directly ink the wood up. And as you can see in this image, would run that through the press. And incorporate a process referred to as chincolle, which literally means Chinese glue. And it's a process in printmaking where a thinner paper, usually a Eastern style or Japanese paper, is glued down onto a print during the process of running it through the printing press. So these have a lot of planning that go into them. From the very beginning, but then they're also a little bit spontaneous, because there would be a lot of decisions that I would make right at the press bed of where something would go as I was working. This work is inspired by a first century epic poem referred to in English, On the Nature of Things, and it was written by Lucretus. And the whole goal of this book is to explain to the general audience who is reading it that everything that happens in the universe is not because of, God's up above, but can be explained through natural phenomenon. So he actually talks about atoms and things of that nature in this book. And it's a poem too, so it's really beautifully phrased. Nothing comes from nothing. Phrases like that just really resonated with me. So I let that kind of poetic quality, I've mentioned that before, come through the work. I almost see these as like little concrete poems. And I intentfully tried to leave a lot of the negative space in this piece as sort of like a meditation or pause. And so that the print and the photograph would really kind of pop out from that space.
I have a comment from Facebook. It
Oh
says,
yeah.
just deconstructing the sublime.
Ah, I love that. I'm going to steal that. Thank you.
Really, nice comment. And please, if anyone has questions, please submit them through the chat line or on Facebook, and I will get to them.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm writing that down so I don't forget it.
Constructing the
Deconstructing the
sublime.
sublime. And I can go back to my childhood again for a moment. Wood has also been something else that, as a material, I've just always been very interested in. And when I was a little girl, I grew up in the mountains of East Tennessee. My grandmother had this amazing wooden headboard on the bed that I would sleep in at her house that had a very obvious bird's eye maple pattern to it. And as a little kid, I thought that that pattern of wood grain actually were souls captured in the wood. Okay, so, and I was kind of enamored at that thought of life being caught in a piece of wood. Now, I don't today think that souls or ghosts are caught into wood. And maybe as a kid, I watched too much late night TV. But I do feel like in this process, when I'm working with the wood, I'm literally printing that record of life that happened, with the soft grain and the hard grain of the wood that shows that transaction of material. Of course, this wood isn't cut so that we could see the growth rings, but I think that's the phenomena that most of us are familiar with wood. So I feel like it's kind of, again, showing that invisible really directly through the process of actually inking and transferring. And then I very carefully tried to compose these pieces so that there would be that harmony between the shapes and the forms in both the photographic elements and the wood elements and color as well. So it's a very intentionally limited palette, and shapes were thought of really carefully as I was working on these, before and during printing.
So is there minimalist artists that inspire you? Is there some artist in particular that inspires your art making?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think immediately when I think minimalism, um, Agnes Martin comes to mind. Also a great lover of graphite and grids, although used in different ways.
Yes.
Um, I also, look, although maybe not quite minimalist, Hilma A.F. Klimt, one of the early abstract female artists. And both Martin and Klimt, were very interested in that contemplative or mystical way of looking at the world and their writing and their art. And I think, that is coming through here, right? That I have this filter of wanting to capture, the invisible qualities of life and record those on paper. It's for me, it's a energetic transaction. And I think about that a lot in my work of like, my marks transfer my energy onto paper, and in the case of the print, the energy of the found wood. I also really love Mark Rothko, and the Houston Chapel pieces, that just density of color that comes through to his work, and the idea of generosity that I think of when I think of Rothko's work of doing something that would be available for anyone to have access and meditate on.
Do you, when I'm thinking of Helma Klimt, she used a lot of symbolism in her work. And you mentioned the writing from Agnes Martin and Klimt. Is writing important to your practice?
Yes, it is, although not always formally. I think formally, of course, it becomes a different thing. But I think if I were to pick up my sketchbook and show it, you would see that it has as much writing in it as it does drawing and sketching and color swatches and things like that. It for me, it definitely goes hand in hand. That the visual language is backed up and explored through the written language, even if not directly.
I see. And what is your daily practice like?
My daily practice. Typically, it's a lot of drawing, you know, and it will vary from day to day, because I tend to set things up and work through them. So sometimes I'll have a period of time where I might take care of the inkjet printing, because it's sort of like I get into that flow. I've got the machine figured out, it's working for me. Then I'll just keep going and print out images that I might use for the next 20 pieces. Other times I'll just be in consistent drawing mode where I'm working. And then, of course, I also like to build in some reflective time. You know, I think that's really crucial, that there's times that I'll work on a drawing, set it aside, think it's done, and then come back and be like, no, it's not. I think that's really important to add in and mention about my practice.
These two works are, I think, my favorites. So please tell us. These are just wonderful.
Thank you. So the one issue I've had with doing the combination that I do of photography and drawing is oftentimes being limited by the printers that I have access to. So in some ways, this series, it broke the printed element down into more of a collage element, so I could expand and go a little bigger. So they're actually 30 inches by 22, or a full-size sheet of paper. And again, with this series, I was really thinking about structure and systems and science, and in particular, crystallography, and this idea of how when we look at a crystalline form, like these two examples from the Mineral Museum in Paris, the shape of the exterior form is always dictated by the internal angles within. And as much as a half a degree change in the molecular structure creates a completely different form. And I found that really intriguing. I also love this museum. The last time I was in Paris, I think I went back like 4 or 5 times to see these structures and document them. So that started to come through in this work, is like playing with this kind of faceted quality of nature and how things interact, and bringing in more of those textures and forms again. Sometimes making space twist, and also my sense of humor. This piece here, All As Continuously So, that's on the right, I was thinking about, you know, we sometimes hear that joke about, you know, the earth being flat, and I was literally thinking like, well, what would happen if the earth wasn't round, if it were a cube? Would gravity still work? Would the tides still flow over the horizon? And things like that. So it's just sort of my visual kind of play on some of those ideas and thoughts that I have in my journals, in my sketchbook, as I'm visiting museums. So that gets us up to what I've been doing, and you asked me about my daily practice since March.
You've been working out of your home.
Right. Yes.
You have a studio at the bakehouse, but that was closed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I felt very lucky in that, you know, that's the great thing about working with drawing. It is especially graphite. It's clean. It can be moved just about anywhere. So once we went on lockdown back in March, I was able to set up and jump in to just keep working here at home. And it was a nice way to kind of finish off some pieces and some ideas, and to make sure I stayed kind of sane. So in this series, I feel like I'm still playing with the same ideas, and it's really obvious the architecture starts to do something different. And it's interesting to see how much affect kind of comes in these pieces, where the architecture now, instead of being open and airy, is actually pressing in this very different way in this work than what the previous work had done.
Think that has anything to do with being lockdown?
I think it has everything to do with,
so.
with lockdown, you know. But also just working through it in a different way too. But definitely, and I think like you can see this here, echo of the past and how. The other interesting thing we've talked about ledger paper is that I can't completely control what the inkjet does. It's oftentimes buffered, which means it's sprinkled with calcium carbonate to make it smooth and to prevent ink from bleeding into it. So you can see here that in some cases, the inkjet just gets more of a almost marbled or craculature effect, which gives the work a different kind of quality than when I use other papers. And I sort of like that lack of control. So we've worked on this series. These were the pieces that were shown online in the South Bend Museum of Art exhibition. I've also worked on this little series that I've just called Borrowed Sky series, where I actually took a couple of magazines and removed every image of the sky in the magazine. And when I should be a little bit more direct, they were copies of Vogue. Because I was really intrigued with how it almost becomes like another commodity, this beautiful kind of landscape for a model to be standing in. And I also use the word borrowed because all of the other work, the photos are my photos, whereas obviously in this case, they are not. So this has just been a fun kind of formal play on space. In this case, these are very small, a tiny little ledger book that I picked up back in the fall at the Miami Book Fair that a vendor had. And I feel like the landscape is, you know, suggested, but then not in this work in a very different way. And every time now that I see the piece on the upper right, I sort of see that shape, which was naturally there. I'm just cutting out the other elements of the photograph. That kind of reminds me of the peninsula of Florida in this weird way. I've also used this time to play around with color. Back in February, I picked up some very nice high-end colored pencils by Karen Dosh. That are light fast, meaning that they won't fade over time. So sheltering in place was a good time to kind of pull those out and to start working and playing with them. And I've really enjoyed this series, and you know, they're fairly new, so it is again about this warping and twisting in space, but very different with the addition of colors and balancing the cool blues of the skies that I collaged down in some cases with, you know, these brilliant reds and oranges.
Beautiful.
Thank you. And then that's continued on into these as well. Just what can I do with color? How do I want to continue to incorporate it? I feel like that's sort of the maybe the Miami influence as well, with the vivid colors that I see here. As Regina was talking before we got started, with orchids and foliage and things like that. That's really new to me. And then you had asked me about the use of a grid and how that might come through in my work. This series, which my working title is just the Site Visit Project, was a series that I started at the bequest of a curator from South Africa for an online and hopefully in-person exhibition, loosely based on the idea of postcards, or the original postcards that started actually in Paris, the carte de visite. So these little drawings, they're 5.5 by 8 inches. So they are the size of one of the standard US postcard sizes. I actually went through the inventory of my photographs from travel and started to pull out some of the sky scenes from them. So images from Malta, Scotland, Paris, some places around the US, and I printed them out and started drawing on top of them. And what's really interesting, and I love this kind of how this happened is before this curator had reached out to me, I'd been doing research on Victorian mourning stationery. And I also kind of love the Victorians in this weird way for how they would have so many rituals and rules for different things in life, and one was for mourning. And I think we're probably most aware of it from movies and things, right, where women would and men would have to wear black for a year to 2 years after someone passed in their family. Well, Victorians also had special stationery that they would use for their correspondence during a time of mourning. And that stationery would just have and it would be hand applied, typically a black border around the stationery. So as I was thinking about postcards and travel, and I had been researching this mourning stationery, this seemed like a great place to kind of just put it all together, because I feel like one of the things that we've all gone through since March is a bit of mourning. We've mourned, you know, travel, seeing family, just that kind of upset in what our normal life was. So this series, and there will be at least 20 images, are all sort of like my little mourning cards, reflecting on the past couple of months. And again, they're graphite, and I'm building it up to different degrees. I'm also looking at traditional postcards and how some are full bleeds, like the larger image where the image will go all the way to the edge of the card. Others have different borders. So once they're assembled in a grid, that should come out to see.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then I think, yeah, the last thing that I'm playing around with, and this is something that you were asking me about my practice and daily and how it works. I'm still on the point of doing a lot of the prep work for this, because I think my next pivot point is thinking differently about drawing and taking it away from that kind of rigidity of the paper, and making it into something a little bit more fluid. So I've actually been printing inkjet prints onto a special fabric that's designed for running through the inkjet. And then I'm starting to draw onto it, thinking about ways that it can be displayed, as in these cases, draped around or over things. I've actually, and I have one small one where it's just kind of a demo here where I've been stitching.
Oh,
you know,
I didn't know you were doing fiber arts too. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think it just, this has been rumbling around in my sketchbook for some time. And so I'm excited to kind of really get started on it. And it also kind of hit me as I talked about my childhood a lot through this presentation. It is sort of a little bit of a return to my roots, because my grandmother, my great-grandmother, all the women in my extended family made quilts and were seamstresses. And I made my sister's wedding gown and my own prom dresses. But I've never incorporated that in any way into my art practice. And so I'm seeing this as a way to kind of, explore and maybe bring some of those skill sets into what I do. And of course, I'm right at the beginning, so who knows exactly where this will go, but I'm definitely excited about that potential.
Wow, Jennifer. Well, we're almost out of time, but this was really wonderful. And you've been so busy. I don't know, when do you sleep and eat? I know you've had online exhibitions. I see that you organized a residency. You're doing things at the bakehouse. And you're making all this artwork. I'm like, wow. So you're not taking any time to, as you said, I guess, mourn what we're going through, but I guess your mourning series, all of this is like a meditative practice, I would imagine. I'm not sure. I would say to help you get through what we're going through, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think Is being very mindful and quieting. So it's definitely very meditative, and that process is really my quiet time.
Wow, well, it's really wonderful. I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would like to get everyone to say hi to you that's on. And also, just so you know, we were streaming on Facebook and Instagram, so we have viewers that were on that as well. And we'll post this so that some maybe your future students can come back and see this, because I know you're teaching a few classes in the fall.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
If you don't mind, stop sharing. I'm going to see
Okay.
if I can go ahead and
there we go.
let all the participants say hello. Let me see. Unmute all. Did I unmute everyone? So thank you again, Jennifer. I would like everyone to give you a round of applause or virtual thank you for joining us. It was so great to see everyone joining us. And I look forward to seeing everyone in our next art talk, which will be, we're taking a few weeks off, so it will be the end of August or 1st of September when the classes start again. And I look forward to seeing everyone then. And again, thank you so much, Jennifer. I love your work. I can't wait to see what you're going to do with live arts. I'm fascinated with that.
Thank you so
Great
much.
presentations. Great presentation, Jennifer.
Thank you, David.
Hi, David. Oh, I love your studio. Where are you? Are you in Miami?
I'm working. I'm in Broward.
Oh, you're in Broward. Well, it's great to see everyone. Thank you, guys. I look forward to our next
so much.
talk.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Jennifer.